Hi, welcome to the course. My name is Fuad, and this video series will help you understand your reading material, assessment, and health professions education. Now, I'll point out to you in this series what's important, what's not so important. So, let's go right to it. So, that is the concept of purpose and purpose-driven assessment, and then he goes on to introduce two frameworks which we can use to think about the validity of our assessment. And now we come to the second framework, which is Messick. Messick's validity framework, sources of evidence. Now this is more common. If you look at the documents talking about validity, more often they will talk about Messick's sources of evidence. What does that mean? Messick grouped evidences that we can use to assess validity, and he outlined 5 groups in an earlier document. Content evidence: what are the content of your assessment? If you are saying that we are assessing clinical competency, your assessment content should have items which talks about competency, talks about clinical competency, talks about problem solving, and all the attributes that are related to clinical competency. That's in terms of the content. Okay, response process evidence, the second group. Response process evidence, second source, is are the candidates responding in the way that you assume? Are they familiar with the assessment process? Are they familiar with how to fill in the blanks, how to fill in the assessment form, the OMR form? They might be competent, but because they're not familiar, then the scores which they get does not reflect their competence. So response process is the examinee's cognitions and behaviors when responding to assessment tasks are consistent with the intended interpretation and use of scores. Okay. The third source of evidence is the internal structure. This is the more statistical part, where people talk about the reliability, Cronbach's alpha, inter-rater reliability, and so on and so forth. And the fourth source of evidence is the relations to other variables. Okay, how our assessment correlates with other assessment, either at the same time or nearly at the same time or in the future. If students do well in our assessment, will they do well in another assessment which looks at a similar attribute? For example, will the students who do well in our final year medical professional assessment, they will do well later on when there is a national or during the end of posting house officer assessment. Those who do not do well in our exam, they tend not to do well also in that assessment. So there's a correlation. That's also another group of evidence. If it correlates well, then we have good evidence. If it doesn't correlate well, then we have lost, or we are weak in one source of evidence. And number 5 is consequences. Consequences: does our assessment lead to suitable positive consequences and minimal negative consequences? He goes on to talk a bit more about these consequences later on. Okay, and the author mentions something like a gray area, where reliability, where is it put in these 5 groups? The author mentions that Messick later grouped or put forward a 6th source of evidence, generalizability, which also included reliability, synonymous with reliability. But in some books, reliability, Cronbach's alpha are put in the internal structure. So just be aware of that. Okay, so in this book is put as separate category, but in the first edition where they introduced this Messick's validity framework, it is put in the internal structure. Just be aware of that. And again, the table helps you very much. Please go through the table 2.2, where they outline the samples of evidence, the example of evidence, and first column is written examinations, second column is performance examinations, and what are the examples of evidence that we can look for in each of the sources of evidence: content, response process, internal structure, relations to other variables, consequences, and generalizability and reliability. Remember, in this book, it is put as the sixth source, right? Previous book, they put it in the same group as internal structure. All right. So just be aware of one thing. It says here, understandably but unfortunately, at the last sentence of page 26, this, which is looking at sources of evidence, can encourage scholars to conduct assessment and validity investigations aimed at collecting at least one bit of evidence for each of the 5 Messick sources. So again, you go into this checklist thinking. Okay, we have 5 sources or 6 sources, and we go through each source. We what is evidence for this one, for this one, for this one. It becomes robotic. It becomes unthinking. It becomes just as a routine that we do. What he's saying is that we should consider whether we are collecting discriminating evidence about controversial assumptions. Okay, so he suggests that use Keynes' validity framework to guide logic, and Messick's validity framework to think broadly about potential sources of evidence, and this makes for a powerful combination. And lastly, in this group of issues, he goes on to discuss in the section evaluation frameworks the issue of consequences of assessment. That is, if you see, there's a big source under Messick's validity framework, and he says that people do not look at this as often as he would like to. Okay, as often as he would like people to look at it. Okay, and he goes on to describe the 4 important dimensions of the consequences of assessment, and it is worth looking at because consequential evidence is part of the validity evidence and shouldn't be ignored.